know who Neil deGrasse Tyson is? Mr. Cosmos, right? He's an astrophysicist and public spokesman for science and reason. Well, last year in an interview, he was asked if he believes in God. And he said, "The more I look at the universe, the less I believe that there is something benevolent going on. You look at disasters that afflict Earth and life on Earth, volcanoes, hurricanes, tornadoes, earthquakes, diseases, pestilence, congenital birth defects. You look at this list of ways that life is made miserable on Earth by natural causes, and I just have to ask, how do you deal with that? I have no problem if, as we probe the origins of things, we bump into the bearded man. And if that shows up, we're good to go. There's just no evidence of it." Well, here Tyson is talking about what theologians call natural evil. That's death and suffering by non-human agents. It's a time-worn problem and a pretty good argument against God. Speaking of evil, last year a stray red tabby showed up at our house. We named him Louie, and we fed him tuna, so he stayed. And these days, he spends his time napping and striking poses in our backyard. He's a living lawn ornament, discreet, graceful, and completely inoffensive. Except when he catches small animals, traps them in our glassed-in patio, and tortures them. During these hours, and I do mean hours, our backyard, which is nicely landscaped, full of flowers and photosynthesis, becomes the backdrop for Louie's theater of death. Last May, my son Henry and I were in the kitchen next to the patio. We looked out and we saw that Louie had a baby rabbit back there. Yeah, the little guy was very bad off, so we couldn't help. So we just turned our attention elsewhere. But 30 minutes later, we heard 3 loud shrieks, high in pitch, rising and abruptly cut off, and the sound just echoed in my head for days. Human beings sometimes suffer similar ends, right? Drawn out, natural, brutal, and completely mindless. So I get it when Tyson talks about nothing benevolent going on. There are all those diseases after all, and natural disasters, and genetic mishaps. I'm surprised that Tyson didn't include a catastrophic asteroid impact to his list, which is simply a matter of time. But really, we don't need a list to know the truth. Every life, human and otherwise, is at every moment vulnerable to 10,000 oblivions. Yet, friends, here we are, tonight, at THEOED. Here we are. This fact is easily overlooked, but it is very important. It took a lot to get this thing together tonight. It took a lot to put THEOED together, and I think that the organizers have done a lovely job of it. But it took more work even than they appreciate. See, in order to make THEOED possible, you first got to have a universe in which to have it. So a bang is in order. The bigger, the better. And once you get the bang, you need to have light come from it. And from that light, you've got to have both matter and antimatter. But there's a trick. You need slightly more antimatter than matter, and that's harder than it sounds. And then you got to wait around for billions of years while nuclei are prepared inside of stars and dying stars and supernovas. They have to be bound up just right, too, not too loose and not too tight. And then they got to mosey around the universe and pick up some stray electrons and become atoms. And then they have to wander around the cosmos for longer, 100 million years plus, before they finally settle down on a nice planet somewhere, not too hot, not too cold, and combine to form molecules. And from there, somehow, they become bacteria. Then you got to wait around for 1.5 billion years for that bacteria to turn into something like algae. And then from there into fish. And then from fish into amphibians, and from amphibians to reptiles. And from reptiles to these weird rat-like primates. And then those have to evolve into hominids. And eventually, after all that, they evolve into THEOED organizers. There's a whole lot of work that has to happen and a lot of problems to be solved, a lot of requirements to be met before you get to stuff like marketing and printing the programs and figuring out who's going to take care of the kids. So we're here tonight, friends, in the middle of existence, and it's a lovely evening. Now, I, for one, am very impressed with existence. So much so that I think that when you take Tyson's list of miseries and weigh them against the miracle of this evening and the cumulative miracle of all evenings and all mornings and all moments of existence, I think that list comes up short as an argument against God. But back to existence. If it sounds strange to talk about existence, it's because existence is rarely even thought about, and it's rarely thought about because it's rarely sensed, But still, with Tyson, I think that he's a smart guy. He knows how unlikely it is for us to be here tonight. He knows that. But he still says there's nothing benevolent going on somehow. There's still nothing benevolent going on. If he was sort of a mopey, depressed kind of person, I would say, oh, that's just Tyson being Tyson, But he's not. He's a, forward thinker and a straight-up kind of guy. So maybe it's me. Maybe I'm the one that's weird here. It could be. When I was about 10 years old, I was playing at some game at church. I was running through the halls with my friends at breakneck speed, And at one point, I had to get from one side of the sanctuary to the other, And I ran in, but I was brought up short by the darkness and the silence in there. This was in Buckhead, right up the road a few miles. There was always cars and noise and traffic around, but it was so dark and so spacious and so weirdly silent in there. I think my 10-year-old brain thought, maybe God really does live in there. So when I became an astrophysicist later on, maybe I had no problem with God because darkness and spaciousness and silence and God all just went together, so well. But now back to existence. It does sound strange to talk about existence, and that's because it is, in fact, rarely acknowledged. But it's rarely acknowledged because it's rarely sensed. Science can help us to become aware of it, and so can art, music, sustained religious practice, even great violence or great loss can do it. But mostly, we walk around, sunk into everydayness, in the words of Walker Percy. And in such a state, it is easy to miss the benevolence and the generosity, even the gratuity of existence. One thing about existence you'll get clear is that it is generous, but it is also, by all accounts, without exception, described as beautiful. Now, by beautiful, I don't mean pretty. Sister Wendy Beckett is a Roman Catholic nun and an art critic, and she nailed it when she said that beauty is not a pretty word, but it is a strong word. I know somebody who might agree with Sister Wendy. In our family's folklore, he is known as Peter the Mean Neighbor. Peter lived near us years ago. He wasn't grumpy, and he wasn't cantankerous, and he wasn't depressed. He was mean. And he taught meanness to his son, who often bullied Henry, 2 years younger than him. More than once, I had to drive that young demon out of our front yard. More than once, I had to explain to Henry that some people are just mean. Well, one day, summer day, a storm blew through, and there appeared in the east a double rainbow, the likes of which I had never seen and have not seen since. So I stood in my yard staring at it, stupefied. Peter emerged from his house, and his response was, shall we say, less reserved. A wide and wild smile broke across his lips. He whooped and he hollered. His body sprang and twisted with each barbaric yawp. He looked like a bull rider without the bull. He was like a boy, vulnerable, new, not mean, and filled to overflowing with this holy and astonishing thing he was seeing. That is what beauty can do. Surely, that is the work and promise of God and a foretaste of the great and general feast. Whoa, I hear Tyson say, beauty, sure, but God, holiness, there is no evidence. But he's a scientist, he keeps an open mind. He says we may yet bump into the bearded man as we probe the origins of things. That's certainly a little slice of irony from Dr. Tyson there. But what I want to know is this. What does he think it would really look like if scientists were to come across God? In my own time as a scientist, I worked in two directions and ended up in two equally remote locations. As a graduate student and postdoc, I studied atomic nuclei. With our trusty proton accelerator, we drilled down into the heart of matter and mapped out details of certain nuclei, details no one had ever seen before. And we were captained down the rabbit hole by quantum mechanics, which is a counterintuitive but reliable guide to the world of the impossibly tiny. And at no point on the journey did any one of us bump into anything that Tyson might admit is divine. We found no bearded men, no secret encoded messages, no particles in the shape of Jesus, no stamp saying, made by Yahweh. And my dissertation said nothing about God. As an astrophysicist, I traveled in the other direction. Our group worked on quasars, among the most distant objects ever studied. I remember one quasar in particular, 3EGJ2006 minus 2321. That's catchy, huh? Astronomers have a real knack for names. Anyway, the light from this quasar traveled for 7 billion, that's a B, billion years before being intercepted by our orbiting telescope. We collected, sifted the data, and it was just as it had been in the nuclear lab. Not one of us bumped into God. So the paper on 3EGJ2006 minus 2321, like all papers in the Astrophysical Journal, is silent on the topic of God. Drill down to the heart of matter, and you do not bump into God. Peer outward to the edge of the Big Bang, and you do not find God. But what you do find, friends, is beauty, and plenty of it, all the way down and all the way out. Granted, this is not the obvious beauty of a double rainbow. The beauty of physics takes work, it builds over time. It fills the mind with light and space and mathematics and existence. I hear Tyson say, but God, does it fill it with God, with holiness? Here I say yes. And here I might leave Tyson and empiricists and atheists behind, but that's okay. For all I know, they will enter the kingdom of God ahead of me. But beauty, friends, is not just, epiphenomenal froth cooked up by our oversized human brains for the purpose of somehow surviving in a brutal cosmos. Don't get me wrong. Scientific explanations are good so far as they go, but sometimes they don't go far enough. Beauty, I say, is a reliable clue to the secret of the whole world. It is recognition, friends. It is the divine image in us recognizing itself in a world made and being made by God. The book of Job has something to say about this. You remember Job, the greatest of the men of the East. He's wise, he's a judge, he's rich, he's compassionate, he's pious, he's loved by everybody. Then boom, he loses his children, his health, his wealth, and very importantly, his social position, and finds himself outside the city walls, on the ash heap, naked, mocked, and spat upon. His friends stop by, and they make things worse. They say Job had it coming because of some secret sin he committed. Job's not buying it. He knows he's innocent, so he tells his friends to just shut their yaps. They don't. So Job turns to God, begging for justice, or barring that, at least a decent explanation. This goes on for 36 chapters. Really great chapters. They're a little intense, but they're great. Finally, God answers Job from the whirlwind, not with a theory of justice or some kind of explanation, but with a vision of the beauty of the world. God shows Job the earth and the sea and the sky, Orion, the great bear, the Pleiades. God takes Job to the wilderness and shows him the mountain goat, the wild ass, the wild ox, the ostrich, the eagle, and more. All of these features of the cosmos had been sort of mere dots on the periphery of Job's imagination, of his consciousness. But now he sees them as if for the first time through the eyes of God. And friends, they are beautiful. Even the dark things shine. The vulture, living on death and feeding blood to its young, is ordered and loved by God. And after God takes Job down into an up-close and very personal encounter with the great sea serpent Leviathan, our hero is satisfied. Turns to God and says, I had heard of you, God, by the ear, but now my eye has seen you. Now my eye has seen you. Yet, strictly speaking, Job did not see God. God was not floating around among the stars of Orion or strolling in the wilderness alongside the ostrich. What Job saw was the earth and the sky and the sea and an oddball assortment of wild animals, the beauty of the world. Yet Job says to God, my eye has seen you. What I take from this is simple. When you see and love the beauty of the world, you see and love God. My dad was my rock and my counselor, and he died in 2016 at the hands of one of the items on Tyson's list of miseries, leukemia. He was strong and he fought like hell, but in the end, he couldn't beat it. And after this happened, after Dad died, weird stuff started happening to me. You know, I began to lose track of things. My mind lost track of things. I missed interstate exits. I missed appointments. You know, one time I forgot the names of my best friend. Name of my best friend. That's a weird feeling, to stand in the living room and to try to remember your best friend's name for 45 seconds. My mind seemed to be taking a long nap and wouldn't be bothered. Speaking of naps, I slept a lot. It was hard to wake up in the morning, and in the afternoon, I would find myself drifting off. And I avoided social situations. Even perfectly benign ones, they were too much work. Just too much work. But these are all common effects of grief, common symptoms, but there was one more, and that is that I became extremely sensitive to the beauty of the world. One night, I was working with my daughter, my teenage daughter, on her homework, and I noticed her hands, miraculous creation's hands. I saw that Julia's are a near-perfect mix of mine and my wife's. Turn them one way, they're mine. Turn them another, they're Elizabeth's. But of course, they're neither mine nor Elizabeth's. I stopped involuntarily to look at leaves, at trees, at the moon. One day, I was dumbstruck at the sight of Kristen, our youngest, picking mulberries and dropping them in her toy watering can. I heard my wife, Elizabeth, laugh, and it sounded like, to my ears, like running water. I observed the moles and the chipmunks and the squirrels and the rabbits and the birds in my backyard with an admiration bordering on worship. One day, a Cooper's hawk lit on the garden wall outside of our kitchen window. Now, this is a lovely and rather uncommon bird, so I stopped to look at it, and it looked so bright and so alive. Its orange eyes were, scanning the backyard for lunch, and I had a vision in my mind's eye, a scientific one, something that Annie Dillard once described. I saw the hawk's evolution in reverse. I saw its wings furl up into forelegs. I saw its beak lose its hook and sort of flatten, smooth off. And I saw its feathers morph back into scales. And there, on the garden wall, in the shade of a laurel in my backyard in Decatur, Georgia, stood a Mesozoic lizard. A Mesozoic lizard. I think I understand Job better now than I did before Dad died. Grief hollows us out. It empties us of conceit and trivia and self-obsession, and the beauty of the world just comes flowing in. And science compounds that beauty tenfold and shows us that we are surrounded, utterly surrounded by God, and always have been. For Job, it was the ostrich and the stars and Leviathan that did it. For me, it was the moon and laughter and a Cooper's hawk and evolution. What I think, friends, is that science often amplifies whatever previous commitments we bring to it. If Tyson brings skepticism to science, he will walk away more skeptical than ever. If I bring conventional religious belief to science, I will walk away radicalized, knowing that the cosmos is a cathedral, and that God is not a stamp or a code or a thing among things. God is instead the ground of all being. And God is the mystery behind this beauty that we call existence. And friends, science only deepens that mystery. It does not and cannot possibly solve it. Death comes to all creatures, sometimes quickly, sometimes slowly. And I, for one, don't know what happens when we die. The idea of heaven, grows less ludicrous to me as I get older, but it remains a hope and not a belief. And tonight, that hope consists of nothing more than Neil deGrasse Tyson, Peter the mean neighbor, Dad, and me sitting around having a laugh and a drink in a world just slightly more beautiful than this one. Thank you.